Good evening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the little bit of time in breakout session, and we are going to dig back into Heschel's essay on prophetic consciousness. What manner of man is the prophet? The first chapter from his 1962 book, The Prophets, based on his 1936 dissertation. The book, and particularly the essay, this first chapter, that he credits with his engagement in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, seeing the study of the prophets as his transition from a person who found their primary purpose in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall, to a person who found their purpose in communities of change makers. And so we are going to dive back into that wonderful essay and explore a little bit further what Heschel means when he speaks about the character of the prophets. I want to just remind us where we were. We started with a distinction being made between philosophers and prophets. That Heschel says that philosophers are interested in what are classically thought of as great problems, problems of the mind, problems of being and becoming, definitions and demonstrations. What do we mean by the words we say? How ought we live our lives on earth? What does it all mean to be in this world? What is reality all about? Heschel says those are all fine questions for philosophers to ask, but they're not the question which animate the prophets of Israel. The prophets of Israel are animated by what might be thought of as small questions, questions having to do with the real life experience of people living in situations of vulnerability. Heschel says the philosophers take us to the elegant mansions of the mind, while the prophets take us to the slums. And we talked together about what are the different kinds of questions that one might ask in a place of being with people in vulnerability that might be different than the kind of questions one might ask from the remove of the study hall or the ivory tower. And you can see here that transition he talked about in that final interview with Carl Stern, where he talked about moving the center of gravity for himself from his study out into the world, moving from the philosophic tradition that he was trained in a Germanic university in Berlin, to adopting this prophetic consciousness for himself and realizing that he couldn't be isolated away from the world. He needed to be living in it. Then we started talking about this sense of, okay, if the philosopher is interested in questions that have to do with real life people and people in positions of vulnerability in society, what is how do we assess the importance of these observations that the prophets have? The prophets talking about unfair business practices or social injustice. And we read that he said, to us, a single act of injustice, cheating in business, exploitation of the poor, is slight. To the prophets, it's a disaster. These are things which we expect are going to happen in any society. We expect there's going to be social stratification. We expect there are going to be people who are left behind. We expect, as a matter of course, that some will have harder lives than others. We just chalk it up to ordinary social dynamics and the way things are. Heschel says the prophets feel more fiercely than we do. The prophets don't accommodate themselves to the way things are. The prophets demand, in God's words, the way things ought to be. And as a result, the prophets get treated as not the kind of people that you want invited to the party. They are the Debbie Downers of the ancient world. They are the hysterics, the ones who won't stop crying out about the situation of widows and orphans when everybody else just wants to have a good time and go about their lives. And then we got to this line that I feel is one of Heschel's signature statements, one of the most powerful lines in his vast library. At the bottom of this page, The prophet's words are outbursts of violent emotions. His rebuke is harsh and relentless. But if such deep sensitivity to evil is to be called hysterical, what name should be given to the abysmal indifference to evil which the prophet bewails? If deep sensitivity to evil is to be called hysterical, if the one who won't shut up about the problems of the world is somebody who we all scoot away from on the Group W bench, and somebody who we think of as oversensitive, as needing to calm down, take a deep breath, what do we say about those? And he's including here, of course, ourselves, who come to accommodate ourselves to the way things are and who stop feeling so deeply, who go numb. What name should be given to the abysmal indifference to evil, which the prophet bewails? We're going to turn back to the book of Amos. We're going to turn back to the book of Amos and take a look at this next quote, which he only gives to us in small piece. They drink their wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but they are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. I read this and I said, I'm going to need to get a little bit more context about what he's talking about. So let's go and take a look at what Amos was talking about. Again, Amos, 8th century prophet, doing his prophetic vocation in the northern kingdom of Israel, speaking out particularly against the wealthy and powerful classes in the cult city of Bethel, where there is a worship site and where people are generally economically much better off than they are across the rest of the northern kingdom of the Galilee. And this is what he has to say to them. We're going to spend a little bit of time reading this. Ah, you who are at ease in Zion and confident on the hill of Samaria, you notables of the leading nation, on whom the house of Israel pin their hopes. So Amos is very clearly addressing the people in positions of power. You who are at ease, who are confident, you notables of the nation. Cross over to Kalneh and see. Go from there to Great Hamath and go down to Gat of the Philistines. Are you better than those kingdoms, or is their territory larger than yours? Now, I had to look up some of these names. I knew the Philistines, but I wasn't exactly sure what Kalneh or Great Hamath was. It turns out all of these are neighboring kingdoms to the land of Israel, who had at this point risen and been destroyed. These are each powerful and proud nations that did not survive the Assyrian onslaught that would eventually, in the next century, destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. And he's saying, are you better than those kingdoms? Do you think that you will not be impacted or called to account in the way that those other kingdoms are? Do you perceive yourself to be somehow invincible? Yet you ward off the thought of a day of woe and convene a session of lawlessness. They lie in ivory beds, lolling on their couches, feasting on lambs from the flock, on calves from the stalls. They hum snatches of song to the tune of the lute. They account themselves musicians, like David. They drink straight from the wine bowls, here's the quote, and they anoint themselves with the choicest of oils. But they are not concerned about the ruin of Joseph. Assuredly, right soon, they shall head the column of exiles. They shall loll no more at festive meals. The sovereign God wholeheartedly swears, I loathe the pride of Jacob. I detest his fortresses. I will declare forfeit city and inhabitants alike, declares the Eternal, the God of hosts. What is the critique that Amos is offering the noble classes of Zion and Samaria? What is he saying is true about them? And what resonance might this continue to have just a few centuries later? And by a few centuries later, I mean these days. What do you see here about what he's saying to our ancestors 2,500 years ago? What, if the prophetic tradition is meant to address us in every generation, is he saying to us now? And you can use the raise hand feature to join in the conversation, as Ellen and Howard are doing. You can also feel free to use the chat, but I'd love to have a conversation about this. Yeah, let's start with the Merowitzes, please.
Alas, Babylon, right? It's the same messages, you know. It's like the whole, all you guys think you're on top of the world because you have money and you have wine and all this, but just, God doesn't look favorably on this. And if God doesn't look favorably on this, then you're going to end up in the same stage as all the other entities that God doesn't look favorably on when the Assyrians come, right? And then Babylon is going to come, and same thing's going to happen. And then Persia's going to come, and the same thing's going to happen to Babylon. It never ends. Nobody learns from history, and nobody listens to the prophets. It's almost like Schadenfreude, right? There's almost a sense of, and when it happens, I'm going to be laughing in my grave.
Yeah. A kind of laughter that I wish that I didn't have to laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I I wish that I didn't have to say I told you so. I wish that you wouldn't make the same mistake that all of your neighbors and all of your ancestors made. And yet I know you, and I know that you have the memory of mayflies, and that you think that what happened to your neighbors, somehow you are going to be immune from it. And so the laughter is there, but it's bitter laughter. Yeah. Wendy, would you like to hop in?
Yeah, I couldn't help thinking of the quote, that evil prospers when good people do nothing. Because it sounds like it's highlighting the idea that remaining silent in the face of wrongdoing or injustice can allow harmful things to happen, continue unchecked. That's sort of how it struck me.
There's a line in the Talmud that says, one who is aware of something which is wrong taking place in their household and who does not speak out is held liable for that which takes place in their household. And then goes on and says, the same is true of one's city, the same is true of one's nation, the same is even true of the whole world. One who knows and who stays silent is held liable. And the literal Aramaic there is not actually held liable, but is caught up in it. Meaning, if you don't in some way consciously, intentionally distance yourself from it and be part of the solution to it, you will inevitably find yourself caught up in the conditions and the consequences of that behavior. It's a plague, and you have to actively seek not to get infected. Yeah, please, Teresa, and then Corey.
It's funny thinking about this and how it relates to today. It's very much talking about, like class and money and all of that. But when I think about today and how even like, lower class people, like I'm brokety broke, and yet I have a smartphone. I order things on Amazon. There's a certain level of like consumerism that I engage in. And so it's like even people who think or who legitimately are marginalized by society for any reason, also have this work to do. And that's how I see it applying to now, because I remember reading this article recently about how luxury items are actually a lot cheaper now. And so, like, people love to say, like, oh, don't spend so much on coffee, don't spend so much on whatever. Things like coffee and stuff are cheap compared to buying a house. Like, no one can afford a house, but it's not because they're spending their money on avocado toast, because avocado toast is relatively cheap. You're never going to save enough on avocado toast to be able to afford a house as a first-time homeowner right now. But like, we still have this thing of like, kind of drowning out the world because we're acquiring things, and acquiring things makes us feel better, and being able to eat a certain type of food or have a certain kind of gadget or whatever makes us feel better. And it's like, even, the poorest among us still are like infected with that. So it's like they're not let off the hook either, with this.
We all have our tools to numb out, right? And one of the ways to numb out is to go and acquire more things, and another way to numb out is to drink your wine by the bowlful, and another way to numb out is to surround yourself by people with whom you can make idle chat about this and that, but never wind up talking about the bigger stuff, and you shoot the shit instead of actually digging into the real state of things. We all have these ways of making ourselves numb, and that can only last, I think he's suggesting, so very long for anybody, no matter their position of privilege. Yeah, thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. Corey.
I don't know, a bowl of wine doesn't sound terrible, but okay, so this is a question. What is the meaning of the phrase "the ruin of Joseph"?
So Joseph is being used as a name for the whole northern kingdom, and what he's saying is, here are people who are going about their business and not paying attention as Rome burns around them, or as danger looms that it will.
When I first read it, I read it as like the reference to Joseph more as like someone being cast out by their brothers. So I wasn't sure if that was like a normal kind of reference in these kinds of texts, or if it meant something else.
Play it out.
When I read they're not grieved over the ruin of Joseph, I read that more as like they're not grieved by the idea of somebody being cast out unjustly or treated unjustly, as like that part of the metaphor of Joseph. But could work.
I think the poets are writing in poetry, and so all things are fair in poetry. And to say, here's an echo of all of the names that Amos could be using. Amos is using the name of the brother who gets disappeared because he's a problem.
Right.
Because he says the things that nobody wants to hear, because he's the dreamer. And what happens to dreamers? They get thrown in pits. One of you wrote to me this week and said, we talked a lot about the prophets being radicals. Were they seen as radicals in their day? And so I got to go down a little rabbit hole of exploring all of the different prophetic references to prophets being imprisoned or beaten or expelled or threatened with death. And it turns out almost all of the prophets that we have any sort of biographical stories about, in addition to their prophecies, lived rather miserable lives at the hands of their fellow Jews. Probably not surprising, right? That to be the one who calls out those who are having a good time, lolling on their couches, drinking their bowls of wine, which also doesn't sound that bad, are unlikely to make a lot of friends. And Andy raised the question in the chat earlier on, does anybody actually listen? So yeah, they're crying out, but does this guilt trip that they're offering wind up transforming behavior? Or do they feel like they need to offer it, even knowing that they are going to be abused and ignored and not listened to? There's a tragedy in the prophetic story, right? The one who speaks and speaks and speaks, knowing that they are not going to be able to stop what's coming. Yeah, Alex and then Mitchell.
Maybe.
Jed?
Thing.
You need to unmute Alex.
Yeah, first of all, this I get a picture of the Pesach Seder, reclining, drinking, singing fragments of songs. I don't think these people are doing anything that horrible. They're just overconfident.
Mm.
They're just complacent and they're just overconfident. They've seen the other kingdoms fall, but they're still standing. They've been able to stand up to and get, to Assyria, or at least get along at that point. It's complacency.
Mm.
It's overconfidence. That's a sin here. And blindness as to what's around the corner.
Yeah, this isn't one of those passages where he's offering an indictment of the mistreatment of the poor and the oppression of widows. They are not, Alex, as you say, doing anything wrong. They're sitting around having a good meal, having a laugh, having a drink. What's the problem here? It's not that they are active oppressors and sinners. It's that they are, I think you hit the nail on the head, they are complacent and overconfident. They think that things can just keep going the way they are, and the piper will never need to get paid. Well, eventually the piper needs to get paid. Yeah. Mitchell, please.
Two thoughts somewhat come to mind. While I agree with you that Joseph is a metaphor for the tribe of Ephraim, which was the northern kingdoms, which I think is the majority thinking in terms of what that passage means, the destruction of the northern kingdom and the eventual destruction of the southern kingdom, which sends everyone to Babylon in the Babylonian era. In my mind, I think of two things. Someone who spoke out and paid a price for it, who probably has the most famous name of everyone in the world, is a man by the name of Jesus. If one wants to look at someone who fought for the poor and argued against the government and the rich, one would say, well, if one takes the philosophy in the books of the writings of Jesus, which I've never read, one would think, at least from that perspective, that would be evidence of someone who would have been acting out like a prophet or acting on the words of the prophet to forcefully put. So it would be the same thing for people like Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi. One could say, are we obligated to become that involved? That's an interesting question. Are we complacent if we don't go out and fix the world, but do little things and at the same time be a little bit complacent in our old age and our comfort? That's a very interesting question. I guess the other question is, how do we see it in say between the 17th century and now? We've had 300 years, 400 years between the 17th century and the 21st century. What have we seen in this in all this dynamic that says that the prophecies of the past will come to haunt us in the last 400 years? Or has it all been a growth program of, if we can conquer, we'll take it, we're doing well, or there be the methodology of by getting rid of DEI, we don't face up to the fact that the European peoples that came over to America took power from those who didn't have the power that's existed all over the world over the last 400 years. How do you see this philosophy playing out now?
Yeah. Really important points and questions. And he's writing this passage in 1962. Well, Amos is writing this centuries ago. Heschel is writing about this in 1962, 1 year after he first got involved with the process that would lead to Vatican II in 1961, when he started his first conversations with Cardinal B. For somebody coming from a Polish shtetl, the idea of engagement with Christianity must have been so profoundly outside of his world, so completely seemingly foreign to the world of an Eastern European shtetl Jew. But he spends the remainder of his life through the 60s into the early 70s in deep conversation with Christians, involved with the Catholic Church in Vatican II, involved in the civil rights movement, which was a profoundly Christian movement, involved in the anti-war movement, particularly with Jesuits, with Father Berrigan and others who were standing up against the atrocities happening in Vietnam from a place of faith, and even became the first Jew to have an appointment at Union Theological Seminary in New York, which is right across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's the first one to teach there, and developed a strong relationship with Reinhold Niebuhr. And so, Mitch, you invoke Jesus, and I think it is absolutely fair to say that the New Testament represents some of the best distillation of prophetic thinking embodied in the person of Jesus. Whether one goes for the theology of redemptive sacrifice and rebirth, or God's incarnation on earth, certainly the part of the Jesus message which is the most Jewish is the way in which he rearticulates the message of Isaiah and Amos and Jeremiah, a message of care to the vulnerable and of fundamental equality. Let's move along a little bit. Wendy, you want to get in a word before we do?
Just real quick, since you brought up Jesus, I saw something recently where a businessman asked Jesus, should I put a fish after my logo? And he said, why? He said, so people know I'm Christian. He said, just be Christian, just do your thing and behave like a Christian, and then they'll know.
We could absolutely say the same thing for ourselves, right? As we all are very aware that anytime a Jew messes up in public, we all cringe if their last name is Goldberg or Madoff or fill in the blank, Weinstein. We are all held accountable for each other's sins. We ought to be representing differently for our tradition while carrying our identity in the world. Let's go back to the text. This is a word you don't see in print that much. The niggardliness of our moral comprehension, that means stinginess, the incapacity to sense the depth of misery caused by our own failures, is a fact which no subterfuge can elude. Our eyes are witness to the callousness and cruelty of man, but our hearts try to obliterate the memories, to calm the nerves, to silence the conscience. The prophet is a man who feels fiercely. God has thrust a burden upon his soul, and he is bowed and stunned at man's fierce greed. Frightful is the agony of man. No human voice can convey its full terror. Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. It is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. God is raging in the prophet's words. If you don't have the text, now is a good time to take a quick screenshot of it or a shot with your phone, because I am going to put you into groups to discuss these two paragraphs, and particularly what he means by prophecy is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. What does it mean that this is a form of living? And what does any of this have to do with God? I imagine for some of us, God is a very easy and natural concept, one that we live with and feel comfortable with. For others, it may be a very foreign word. We've talked a lot about people so far, but prophecy is at its heart a language having to do with the holy, having to do with God. What's God got to do with it? Okay. Why don't you get into groups? You're talking about what it means for prophecy to be a form of living. And what does God have to do with any of this? What does it mean that this is a crossing point between God and man? Rooms are open. So in the 5 minutes we have left, a small question. What does God have to do with any of this? What does Heschel mean when he says that prophecy is a meeting point between God and man, and that God is raging in the prophet's words? Let's hear some thoughts. A small question indeed.
Perhaps God has imbued the prophet with his rage.
So the prophet is the earthly representative of God's attribute of anger in the world. If we're taking a Kabbalistic view of this, God has different energies. And here, at least, Heschel is saying the prophet is the one who embodies God's righteous anger in the world. Yeah. Alex.
Yeah. Two possibilities, two ways of looking at that. If you believe in a personal God, if you believe in a living God who acts within history, this God's noticing, this God's getting angry, and this God's going to do things you'd rather not do. If you believe in God as a metaphor for the reality principle, for the laws that that is symbol for underlying ultimate reality, yeah, reality will not tolerate this. So either way, either way that you approach your vision of God, it applies.
Either it's God is coming and boy is he pissed,
Yeah.
or it's
My phone.
the ultimate truth of the universe is that you got to shape up. But either way, the prophet is speaking on behalf of something much bigger than himself.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Teresa?
I love that. Well, one, like the form of living, like this is a part of how you live your life. It's not like one big action. It's like a part of who you are and how you conduct yourself. I also like the phrase crossing point, because I think that's like prophecy and the prophet is God's way of meeting us where we are. It's where we can like cross paths. And that's important. Like it's a way of us kind of hearing the rage that God wants to point out to us in a way that we can like digest and understand. And the last thing, just the word raging, like we were talking about it kind of rightfully as like anger, but also it's like energy. Like I think about like a rager, like a college party, like, it's rage, it's anger, but it's also like energetic. It's like, we have to do something now. It's that. And it's like kind of bringing that to us too.
God is pretty hysterical here, right? God is the one who is shouting in our ear, wake up, don't you see? Don't you see what's going on? Don't you see what's happening in my world? Get up, right? It's sort of akin to the role we say the shofar plays on High Holy Days, that the shofar is a spiritual alarm clock that is meant to say to us, you're sleepwalking through the world. Open your eyes, take a look in the mirror, figure out if this is who you want to be or how you want to be. And if not, what are you going to do about it? Yeah, Tilda.
I'd like to propose an antagonistically humanist perspective, just to throw things out of whack, which is the perspective that in considering prophecy as a behavior, a practice that must be divinely inspired, makes it scarce and difficult. Because anyone who sees an injustice but does not feel the divine inspiration to speak out, to take action, they may not feel as though they have access to the legitimacy of prophecy or that sort of action. Whereas I think that all our label of prophecy should require is seeing a problem and having the natural, practical, realistic, worldly insight to say, this is the harm that problem is causing. These are the consequences of this continued mistake. This is what we are doing wrong. And it is a divine event when someone feels a divine inspiration to engage in that. And it remains an ethical imperative and prerogative. Regardless of the inspiration, it is simply the act of seeing the problem and understanding its consequences that should be sufficient to engage in that warning.
And this is the kind of trick that people in my profession do, and you may or may not consider it cheating, but to say that ethical impulse can be named however you want to name it. If you choose to name that ethical impulse as the natural human impulse to do good, mazel tov. If you choose to name that impulse as the still small voice of God within us, mazel tov, you're still talking about the same voice. And what the prophets don't seem to be dependent on is a whole lot of heaven opening up and them having Mount Sinai level moments. There are a couple of them in the prophetic books, right? Isaiah goes to heaven in chapter 6 and sees choruses of angels shouting, holy, holy, holy. Ezekiel sees a chariot with eyeballs in the wheels. But by and large, those are not the normative experience of the prophets. Amos never has a moment like that. Neither does Micah, neither does Hosea. By and large, they're just saying what they know to be true at the core of their being and saying, this comes from God. This is my bearing witness to God in the world. And so I agree with you. If we are waiting for a Mount Sinai moment in order to feel empowered to act, we will wait a very, very long time. But if we can name and trust the voice within us to say that that matters, and maybe even cosmically matters, maybe even spiritually matters, then we're empowered with the full mantle of the prophetic tradition. I'll leave it there, except because Eric Eisenberg is here on screen, I just have to tell you what fell out of a later page of my copy of the prophets. That's your mom's business card.
Oh my goodness.
Apparently, I got my copy of the prophets from your mother's library when she let me go through it when I taught for her in high school. And I opened up to a much later page than I usually go to, and out fell her business card. I'm pretty sure that when we went in the first session and talked about who was a prophetic voice in your life, that Molly, your mom, was the one you named. And look, she is accompanying this book and this class. So I felt like that was a little message from the other side, or at least a little reminder of a really great lady.
I'll be saying Kaddish for her on the stream this coming Shabbos.
Okay.
So
Well, her
timing
memory is really dear to me. Take good care, everybody. See you next week.
Yeah.
Yasher Koch, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Heschel.
Yasher Koach, and thank you.
You.
was his Eric's son.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you for sweet memory,
Mhm.
and thank you.